For centuries, Europe was a continent of kings, borders, and ancient rivalries. Then, in just a few years, one man came closer than anyone before him to reshaping nearly the entire continent under a single political vision. Yet the strange paradox is this: the empire that tried to unite Europe through conquest ultimately helped awaken the very national identities that would destroy it. Napoleon Bonaparte dreamed of a Europe organized by shared laws, modern institutions, and centralized order. But when soldiers marched across the continent carrying those ideas, many people did not see unity, they saw occupation. So the quiet question remains: was Napoleon trying to build a united Europe, or did his empire unintentionally make that dream impossible? Europe in the late 18th century was not a single political space, and it was not even a collection of a few large nations, as many people imagine today. Instead, it was a landscape of layered authorities, old privileges, and borders that had been shaped by centuries of dynastic marriages, religious conflicts, and fragile alliances. Long before Napoleon Bonaparte appeared on the stage of history, the continent was already defined by division. Kingdoms guarded their independence, nobles defended their privileges, and local rulers often held power that rivaled that of distant kings. In the center of the continent stood one of the clearest examples of this fragmentation: the Holy Roman Empire. Despite its grand name, it was not a centralized empire in the modern sense. By the late 1700s, it consisted of hundreds of duchies, bishoprics, free cities, and small principalities, each with its own laws, taxes, and political traditions. Some territories were no larger than a modern county, yet they possessed full political authority within their borders. Travelers moving across Central Europe could pass through several jurisdictions in a single day, encountering different coinage, customs rules, and legal systems. This patchwork was not accidental. It was the result of medieval traditions in which political authority was distributed among many rulers rather than concentrated in a single state. While France and Britain had gradually developed stronger centralized governments, much of continental Europe remained tied to this older political structure. Beyond the German lands, other regions also reflected the same pattern of division. Italy was not a unified country, but a collection of states, such as the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States, the Duchy of Milan, and the Republic of Venice. Each had its own rulers, alliances, and administrative traditions. In Eastern Europe, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth once stretched across vast territories but had weakened dramatically during the 18th century, eventually leading to its partitions by neighboring powers. Austria ruled a multinational empire that included Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, and many other groups, each with their own languages and local identities. Even powerful monarchies like France governed regions that historically possessed strong local traditions and privileges. This complicated structure meant that the idea of a unified Europe was not only politically unrealistic, but also difficult to imagine within the mental world of the time. Political loyalty was usually directed toward a local ruler, a dynasty, or a religious authority, rather than toward the continent as a whole. Economic life also reinforced division. Trade routes existed across Europe, yet tariffs and local regulations frequently interrupted the movement of goods. Merchants traveling between regions often had to pay duties at multiple borders. Guild systems in many cities controlled who could practice certain trades, limiting economic integration between territories. Roads and infrastructure varied widely in quality, making long-distance coordination slow and uncertain. These conditions did not prevent communication between different parts of Europe, but they did make the continent function more like a mosaic than a unified system. Military and diplomatic rivalries further strengthened this pattern. The 18th century had already witnessed major conflicts, such as the War of the Spanish Succession and the 7 Years' War, struggles in which the great powers of Europe attempted to preserve a balance of power rather than create unity. The goal of most rulers was not continental cooperation, but the prevention of any single state becoming dominant. Alliances shifted constantly as governments tried to maintain this balance. In such an environment, the notion that one political system might someday reorganize most of the continent seemed almost impossible. Yet the conditions that made unity unlikely also created a fragile structure. Because Europe was so divided, changes in one region could ripple outward through diplomacy, war, and ideology. When the French Revolution began in 1789, its political ideas moved across these borders faster than armies could march. The old system of privileges, dynasties, and fragmented authorities would soon face pressures it had not encountered before. Long before Napoleon attempted to reshape the map of Europe, the continent already contained the tensions that made such a transformation both imaginable and deeply controversial. Across much of Europe in the late 18th century, political authority was not only divided between states, but also layered within them. Kings ruled, but their power was rarely absolute in the modern sense. Beneath the crown existed a complex hierarchy of nobles, church institutions, provincial assemblies, and traditional privileges that had developed over centuries. These structures formed the foundation of what historians often describe as the old regime, a system in which social order and political authority were closely tied to inherited status. In many regions, noble families possessed legal rights that allowed them to collect taxes from peasants, administer local justice, or control agricultural lands that had been held by their ancestors for generations. Such arrangements created stability for those who benefited from them, yet they also made political change extremely difficult. Any attempt to reform the system threatened the privileges of powerful groups who had long defended their traditional rights. Because of this, European society was not organized around a single uniform law, but around a series of overlapping customs that varied from region to region. This was particularly visible in France itself. Although the kingdom appeared centralized under the Bourbon monarchy, the country still contained provinces with different legal traditions. Some regions followed Roman-based legal codes, while others preserved customary laws that dated back to medieval times. Tax systems were uneven, and certain provinces enjoyed exemptions that others did not. Even within one of Europe's strongest monarchies, the political landscape remained uneven and fragmented. Similar patterns could be seen across the continent. In the Austrian Empire, for example, the Habsburg rulers governed a vast territory composed of multiple historic kingdoms and provinces. Hungary retained its own political institutions and noble privileges, while other regions were administered through different arrangements. The result was a political structure that resembled a federation of historical territories rather than a unified nation-state. Communication between these regions was shaped by language, tradition, and long-established legal boundaries. For ordinary people, loyalty was often directed toward a local community or ruler rather than toward a broader continental identity. Religion also played an important role in maintaining these divisions. Since the Reformation of the 16th century, Europe had been split between Protestant and Catholic regions. While large religious wars had largely ended by the 18th century, the legacy of those conflicts still influenced politics and diplomacy. Some states remained strongly tied to particular religious traditions, and rulers often viewed religious identity as part of their political legitimacy. This added another layer of separation between different parts of the continent. Economic life reinforced these boundaries as well. Agricultural communities formed the backbone of most European societies, and peasants often lived under systems that tied them closely to the land they cultivated. In Eastern Europe especially, forms of serfdom still existed, requiring peasants to provide labor or payments to landowners. Markets operated locally, and long-distance trade, although important in certain regions, did not yet create a fully integrated continental economy. Merchants traveling across borders encountered different currencies, measurements, and taxation rules, all of which slowed the flow of goods. These practical barriers meant that daily life rarely encouraged people to think beyond the immediate structures that governed them. Yet beneath this stable appearance, subtle pressures were beginning to build. Population growth, expanding commerce, and the spread of new intellectual ideas were gradually challenging the assumptions of the old regime. Enlightenment thinkers across Europe debated questions about political authority, individual rights, and the role of law in society. Their writings circulated through books, pamphlets, and salons, reaching audiences far beyond the royal courts where traditional power was concentrated. Although these discussions did not immediately transform political institutions, they began to change how educated Europeans imagined the organization of society. Some started to question whether inherited privilege should determine political authority, and whether laws should apply equally to all citizens. These debates did not yet propose a unified Europe, but they did introduce the idea that political systems could be redesigned according to rational principles rather than inherited traditions. In a continent long defined by dynasties and fragmented jurisdictions, this shift in thinking was subtle but significant. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, it would transform these intellectual discussions into political action. The ideas that emerged from that upheaval would travel across borders, carried by both words and armies. Long before Napoleon began to redraw the map of Europe, the foundations of the old order were already beginning to shift. Seen from this fragmented landscape, the transformation that would take place in the early 19th century becomes easier to understand. Europe before Napoleon was not a continent waiting to be unified. It was a continent whose political structures had developed in ways that made unity extremely unlikely. Dynasties guarded their independence carefully, and rulers feared the rise of any power that might dominate the others. The diplomatic system that governed relations between states was built on the idea of balance. If one kingdom grew too strong, others would form alliances to restrain it. This balance of power had shaped European politics for generations. It was not designed to create unity, it was designed to prevent it. The logic was simple and widely accepted among rulers. Stability depended on competition between states, rather than on cooperation under a single authority. Because of this tradition, even large empires rarely attempted to control the entire continent. Spain, under the Habsburgs, had once possessed enormous influence, but its power gradually declined. France, under Louis XIV, had pursued expansion, yet coalitions of other powers eventually limited its ambitions. The same pattern repeated throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Each time a state appeared capable of dominating Europe, alliances emerged to stop it. These reactions were not only military, but also political. Courts across the continent understood that their own survival depended on preventing any single ruler from reshaping the entire European system. This long history explains why the idea of a continental reorganization would have seemed improbable to most observers in the late 18th century. Even reform-minded thinkers rarely imagined a single political structure governing most of Europe. Instead, they spoke about improving laws within individual states or creating better relations between governments. The political imagination of the time remained largely confined to kingdoms, empires, and regional alliances. Yet, the end of the 18th century introduced conditions that were different from those of earlier centuries. The French Revolution did more than replace one ruling dynasty with another. It challenged the entire framework of political legitimacy that had supported the old regime. When revolutionary leaders declared that sovereignty belonged to the nation rather than to a monarch, they introduced a principle that could cross borders more easily than dynastic claims. The revolutionary government also reorganized France internally, replacing many historic provinces with departments governed by uniform administrative rules. Laws were rewritten to emphasize equality before the state, and institutions were redesigned to operate with greater central coordination. These changes did not instantly transform Europe, but they demonstrated that large political systems could be redesigned quickly when old traditions were set aside. The revolutionary wars that followed carried these ideas outward. French armies marched beyond their borders to confront coalitions of European monarchies that feared the spread of revolutionary principles. Wherever these armies moved, they encountered societies that still operated within the fragmented structures of the old regime. In some places, local populations resisted the foreign presence. In others, certain reforms were welcomed, especially where feudal obligations or aristocratic privileges had long been unpopular. The continent therefore began to experience a strange mixture of resistance and change. The military conflicts of the 1790s were not yet part of Napoleon's empire, but they created the environment in which a new kind of leadership could emerge. Among the officers serving in these revolutionary armies, was a young general from Corsica whose career advanced rapidly during this turbulent period. Napoleon Bonaparte demonstrated unusual skill in organizing campaigns and directing troops across complex political landscapes. His victories in Italy in the late 1790s revealed something important about the structure of Europe itself. Because the continent was divided into so many separate states and authorities, a determined commander could defeat them one by one, reshaping the political map faster than the old diplomatic system could respond. The fragmentation that had once preserved balance could also create vulnerability. When Napoleon later rose to power in France, he would inherit both the revolutionary ideas that challenged the old regime and the strategic opportunities created by Europe's divisions. The same continent that had seemed impossible to unite would soon experience a series of changes that few people had imagined possible only a generation earlier. When the French Revolution began in 1789, it did not immediately appear as the beginning of a continental transformation. At first, it looked like a crisis within a single kingdom. France was facing severe financial problems after decades of expensive wars, including its support for the American War of Independence. The monarchy of Louis XVI struggled to manage a system of taxation that had long favored privileged groups while placing heavy burdens on ordinary people. In order to address this financial crisis, the king called the Estates General, an assembly that had not met since 1614. It brought together representatives of three traditional social orders: the clergy, the nobility, and the common people, who were collectively known as the Third Estate. What followed was not a simple political meeting, but the beginning of a profound shift in how political authority was understood. Representatives of the Third Estate soon argued that they did not merely represent one social group, but the nation itself. In June 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly and claimed the authority to create a constitution for France. This moment marked a decisive break from the political assumptions of the old regime. Instead of power flowing downward from a monarch who ruled by hereditary right, the new language of the revolution suggested that sovereignty originated from the people of the nation. This idea alone was powerful enough to travel beyond the borders of France. It challenged the legitimacy of traditional dynasties throughout Europe, because if sovereignty belonged to the nation, then the authority of kings could be questioned. Over the following months, the revolution moved quickly. Feudal privileges were formally abolished in August 1789, ending many of the legal distinctions that had separated nobles from commoners. Soon afterward, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen outlined principles that would become central to revolutionary thought. It proclaimed that all citizens were equal before the law and that political authority should exist to protect the rights of the people. These statements did not immediately transform European society, but they introduced a set of ideas that could cross borders far more easily than armies. Pamphlets, newspapers, and personal correspondence carried the news of these events across the continent. Intellectuals, merchants, and officials in other countries began discussing the meaning of these principles within their own societies. In this way, the French Revolution started to reshape political conversations far beyond France itself. The revolution also reorganized the internal structure of France in ways that reflected these new principles. The country's historic provinces, which had once possessed their own traditions and privileges, were replaced by departments with standardized administrative systems. Laws were gradually rewritten to remove many of the legal inequalities that had characterized the old regime. These changes created a more centralized state, one in which the authority of the government could reach more directly into local administration. Observers across Europe noticed that this transformation was not simply a change of rulers, but a restructuring of political institutions. Some reformers admired these developments and wondered whether similar changes might improve governance in their own countries. Others viewed them with deep suspicion, fearing that revolutionary ideas might spread instability across the continent. European monarchies soon began to see the revolution as a threat. In 1792, France found itself at war with several neighboring powers, including Austria and Prussia. These governments believed that the survival of their own political systems required stopping the revolutionary movement before it expanded further. The conflict that followed was not merely a traditional war between states. It became a struggle over political principles, as well as territory. French revolutionary leaders declared that their armies were fighting not only to defend the nation, but also to protect the ideals of liberty and citizenship that the revolution had proclaimed. As the war intensified, French armies moved across borders into regions that still operated under the structures of the old regime. Wherever these forces appeared, they carried with them both military power and political language that challenged existing institutions. This was the environment in which the future of Europe began to change. The revolutionary period did not yet produce a unified continent, but it did create a new situation in which political ideas, military campaigns, and administrative reforms were interacting across borders in ways that had rarely occurred before. In this unsettled world, ambitious military leaders found opportunities that earlier generations might never have encountered. Among them was Napoleon Bonaparte, an officer whose career would soon become closely tied to the expansion of these revolutionary transformations across Europe. As the revolutionary government in France tried to defend itself from foreign coalitions, the nature of war in Europe slowly began to change. Earlier conflicts between European states had usually been limited in scope. Armies were relatively small, campaigns often followed seasonal patterns, and wars were frequently concluded through negotiated settlements once a balance had been restored. The wars that emerged after 1792 were different. Revolutionary France mobilized large numbers of citizens through a policy known as the levée en masse, calling ordinary men to serve in defense of the nation. This transformed the scale of military operations. Armies grew larger, and warfare became more closely connected to political ideas. Soldiers were no longer fighting only for a king or a dynasty. They were increasingly told that they were defending the nation and the principles that had emerged from the revolution. This change affected how war was experienced both by the soldiers themselves and by the societies through which armies moved. As French forces advanced beyond their borders, they entered territories that still operated within the traditional structures of the old regime. In some regions, these armies encountered resistance, especially from rulers who feared losing their authority. Yet the arrival of French forces also brought reforms that challenged long-established privileges. In several areas, feudal dues were reduced or abolished, and new administrative practices were introduced. These changes were not always welcomed by local populations, but they demonstrated that political institutions could be altered rapidly when supported by military power. The spread of these reforms created a new dynamic within European politics. Instead of simply conquering territory, revolutionary armies were often accompanied by officials who reorganized local governments along lines inspired by French institutions. The Rhineland, parts of northern Italy, and the Low Countries experienced some of these transformations during the 1790s. Local elites sometimes cooperated with the new administrations, especially if they believed the reforms would modernize economic life or reduce older feudal obligations. In other places, communities resisted what they saw as foreign interference. The result was a complicated mixture of adaptation, negotiation, and opposition. Even when reforms were unpopular, the experience of rapid political change forced many Europeans to reconsider the stability of the systems under which they had long lived. Communication across the continent helped amplify this effect. Newspapers reported on the progress of the wars, while letters and travelers carried stories from one region to another. Discussions about constitutional government, legal equality, and administrative reform became more common in intellectual circles. These conversations did not always produce agreement. Some observers admired the energy of the revolutionary government, while others feared that the destruction of traditional institutions would lead to instability. What mattered for the broader European landscape was that political ideas were now moving through networks that connected many different societies. Borders remained important, but they were no longer barriers to discussion in the same way they had once been. The Revolutionary Wars therefore created a setting in which both ideas and armies could reshape the continent simultaneously. Within this environment, military leadership became increasingly important. Campaigns were conducted across multiple regions, requiring commanders who could move quickly, coordinate supplies, and respond to changing political situations. Several officers gained reputations during these conflicts, but one of them soon stood out for the speed and effectiveness of his campaigns. Napoleon Bonaparte, a young artillery officer who had risen through the ranks during the early years of the Revolution, demonstrated an unusual ability to organize operations and inspire his troops. His role would become especially visible during the Italian campaigns of the late 1790s, where French forces confronted a series of opposing armies across a landscape already shaped by centuries of political fragmentation. The conditions that had once preserved Europe's balance of power were now beginning to produce different results. A determined commander operating within the revolutionary system could defeat multiple opponents in succession, altering the political map faster than earlier diplomatic traditions could respond. These developments did not yet amount to a unified Europe, but they showed how the revolutionary era had created possibilities that had rarely existed before. The wars of the 1790s, therefore, formed the bridge between the ideas of the revolution and the rise of the man who would soon attempt to reorganize much of the continent. By the end of the 1790s, the French Revolution had already altered the political atmosphere of Europe in ways that were difficult to reverse. The old order of dynasties and privileges had not disappeared, but it now existed alongside a powerful set of new ideas about law, citizenship, and political authority. These ideas had first emerged within France, yet they did not remain confined there. They traveled through armies, through administrators, through merchants and travelers who carried stories from one region to another. In this way, the revolution unintentionally created a network of influence that extended far beyond its borders. The result was not a unified Europe, but a continent increasingly aware that political systems could be redesigned. For many rulers, this awareness was deeply unsettling. Monarchies that had once seemed secure began to fear that revolutionary principles might inspire unrest within their own territories. Governments responded by strengthening alliances and continuing the wars against France. At the same time, reformers in several regions observed the changes taking place and wondered whether some aspects of the new system might improve their own societies. Discussions about legal equality, administrative efficiency, and centralized authority became more common among officials and intellectuals. These debates did not always support the revolution, but they demonstrated that the intellectual boundaries of European politics were shifting. One of the most important changes introduced by the revolution was the emphasis on uniform law. Under the old regime, legal systems had often varied widely from one region to another, shaped by centuries of local customs and privileges. Revolutionary reforms in France attempted to replace this complexity with clearer and more consistent legal principles. The concept that all citizens should be subject to the same laws was both simple and radical within the context of 18th century Europe. Although the revolutionary government struggled to implement these ideas fully during the turbulent years of the 1790s, the principle itself became widely known. In territories influenced by French armies, administrators sometimes attempted to apply similar reforms, reorganizing courts and replacing feudal obligations with new legal frameworks. These experiments were uneven and frequently contested, yet they illustrated a broader possibility that a large territory could be governed through standardized institutions rather than through a patchwork of inherited privileges. This notion would later become central to the political structures associated with Napoleon's rule. Another important transformation involved the relationship between the state and the citizen. Revolutionary leaders argued that individuals were not merely subjects of a monarch, but members of a nation who possessed rights and responsibilities. This language reshaped the way governments mobilized resources and organized armies. Citizens were called upon to defend the nation, and in return, they were promised participation in a political community defined by law rather than by birth. Such ideas did not eliminate social inequality, but they changed the expectations surrounding political authority. Across Europe, observers began to recognize that modern states might rely less on inherited hierarchy and more on administrative systems that treated populations in more uniform ways. These developments formed the intellectual background against which Napoleon's career would unfold. When he emerged as a leading military figure, he did not invent the revolutionary ideas that were spreading across Europe. Instead, he inherited them from the political upheaval that had transformed France during the previous decade. What he would eventually do was combine these ideas with an extraordinary ability to conduct military campaigns and organize governments in territories under French influence. In other words, the revolution supplied the principles, while Napoleon would supply the structure and expansion that carried them across much of the continent. By the time the 18th century came to a close, Europe stood at a moment of transition. The old system of dynasties and fragmented jurisdictions had not vanished, yet it was no longer the only way people imagined political life. Wars continued, alliances shifted, and governments struggled to adapt to a rapidly changing environment. In this unsettled world, individuals who could navigate both military strategy and political transformation gained unusual influence. Among them, Napoleon Bonaparte would soon move from being a successful general to becoming one of the most powerful figures in Europe. His rise would not simply reflect personal ambition. It would also reveal how the revolutionary ideas of the 1790s had created the conditions in which a single leader might attempt something that earlier centuries had considered nearly impossible: the large-scale reorganization of the European continent. Napoleon Bonaparte was not born into the powerful dynasties that traditionally shaped European politics. When he entered the world in 1769 on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, his family occupied a modest position within the island's local society. Corsica itself had only recently become part of France. For centuries it had been ruled by the Republic of Genoa, and in 1768 the island was transferred to French control. Napoleon, therefore, grew up in a place where questions of identity, loyalty, and political authority were still unsettled. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, belonged to the minor Corsican nobility and worked as a lawyer. Through his connections with the new French administration, Carlo secured opportunities that allowed his sons to receive education on the mainland of France. This decision would shape Napoleon's future in ways that no one at the time could fully anticipate. As a young student in France, Napoleon entered military schools that trained officers for the Royal Army. These institutions emphasized mathematics, engineering, and the disciplined study of artillery, a branch of the military that required technical skill as well as battlefield awareness. Napoleon proved particularly capable in these areas. His instructors noted his seriousness and his strong interest in military history. At the same time, his Corsican background made him feel somewhat distant from the social circles dominated by students from established French noble families. This sense of being an outsider may have contributed to the intense focus he displayed during his studies. When he completed his education in the mid-1780s, Napoleon was commissioned as a young artillery officer in the French army. At that moment, his career seemed likely to follow the ordinary path of many officers who served the monarchy. The political system of the old regime still governed France, and advancement in the military often depended on noble connections as much as on talent. Only a few years later, however, the French Revolution transformed the environment in which officers like Napoleon served. The upheaval that began in 1789 disrupted traditional hierarchies and created opportunities for individuals who demonstrated competence and loyalty to the revolutionary government. Many aristocratic officers left France during the early years of the revolution, opening positions for younger men who might previously have remained unnoticed. Napoleon's abilities in artillery and organization allowed him to rise within this rapidly changing system. One of the first moments that brought him wider attention occurred in 1793 during the siege of Toulon. The port city had been seized by forces opposing the revolutionary government, supported by British naval power. Napoleon played a key role in planning the artillery positions that eventually forced the British fleet to withdraw. His performance during the siege impressed senior commanders and helped secure his promotion to the rank of brigadier general at a remarkably young age. This episode demonstrated two qualities that would later define his career: a careful understanding of terrain and logistics, and the ability to coordinate complex operations under difficult circumstances. The following years of the Revolutionary Wars offered additional opportunities. France remained in conflict with several European powers, and military campaigns extended across different regions of the continent. In this turbulent environment, effective commanders could quickly gain recognition. Napoleon continued to show skill, not only in directing artillery, but also in planning broader strategies that allowed French forces to defeat larger armies by moving quickly and concentrating their strength at decisive moments. His reputation grew further after he suppressed a royalist uprising in Paris in 1795, an event that demonstrated his loyalty to the revolutionary government and his willingness to act decisively during moments of crisis. Yet even as his career advanced, Napoleon was not yet the dominant figure who would later reshape Europe. At this stage, he remained one among several capable generals serving the French Republic. What distinguished him, however, was the combination of military success and political awareness that he gradually developed. He understood that the wars being fought across Europe were not only about territory but also about the spread of revolutionary institutions. Commanders operating in regions beyond France often found themselves interacting with local governments, reorganizing administrations, and negotiating with civilian authorities. Napoleon proved unusually adept at navigating these responsibilities. By the mid-1790s, he had become a figure to watch within the French military establishment. The revolutionary era had created a system in which talent and ambition could propel individuals forward with remarkable speed. Napoleon's rise during these years reflected both his personal abilities and the extraordinary circumstances of the time. The next stage of his career would take him beyond France's borders into the complex political landscape of northern Italy, where the fragmented map of Europe would present opportunities that few commanders had ever encountered before. In 1796, when Napoleon Bonaparte was appointed commander of the French Army of Italy, the assignment did not initially appear to be the most prestigious position within the French military. The main focus of the war against Austria was expected to take place along the Rhine, where larger armies were operating. The Italian front had long been considered secondary, supplied with limited resources and composed of troops who were often poorly equipped. When Napoleon arrived to take command, he found an army that had experienced months of hardship. Soldiers lacked proper uniforms, food was scarce, and morale was uncertain after a series of difficult campaigns. Yet the geographical and political landscape of northern Italy presented possibilities that Napoleon quickly recognized. Italy, at that time, was not a unified country, but a collection of states with different rulers and alliances. The Kingdom of Sardinia controlled parts of the northwest, the Austrian Empire dominated the rich region of Lombardy, and smaller duchies and republics filled the spaces between them. This fragmentation meant that opposing forces were divided between several governments, rather than united under a single command. Napoleon understood that if he could move quickly and defeat these armies one after another, the balance of power in the region might change rapidly. Soon after taking command, he began a series of operations that demonstrated this approach. Instead of confronting the Austrian and Sardinian armies together, he maneuvered his forces between them, striking at each separately before they could fully coordinate their defenses. The campaign unfolded across mountain passes, river valleys, and fortified towns, requiring careful planning and rapid movement. Napoleon encouraged his soldiers with promises that success in Italy would bring supplies and opportunities that had been lacking during the early months of the war. His messages to the troops emphasized both practical rewards and the broader revolutionary cause they were said to represent. Over the following months, the French army achieved a sequence of victories that surprised many observers across Europe. Battles such as Montenotte, Lodi, and Arcole demonstrated Napoleon's ability to concentrate his forces at decisive points while forcing his opponents to react to his movements. Although each engagement had its own circumstances, the overall pattern of the campaign showed a consistent strategy: move quickly, separate the enemy's armies, and defeat them in succession. This method allowed a relatively small force to challenge larger coalitions that were spread across different territories. As French troops advanced through northern Italy, the political structure of the region began to change. Several states were compelled to sign treaties with France, while others were reorganized under new governments influenced by revolutionary principles. In places such as Lombardy, French authorities helped establish republics that replaced earlier dynastic rule. These political transformations were closely connected to the military successes of the campaign. Armies did not merely pass through the territory, they often left behind administrative reforms that altered local institutions. This pattern would later become a defining feature of Napoleon's influence across Europe. The Italian campaign also brought Napoleon a level of personal recognition that few generals of his age had achieved. Reports of his victories circulated widely through newspapers and official bulletins, presenting him as a commander capable of reshaping the course of the war. Within France, the government of the Directory saw his successes as evidence that the revolutionary army could defeat established European powers. Diplomatically, the campaign forced Austria to reconsider its position in the conflict. After a series of defeats, Austrian leaders eventually negotiated with France, leading to the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797. This agreement ended the war between France and Austria for the time being and redrew several political boundaries in northern Italy. The treaty also demonstrated how military victories could quickly translate into diplomatic and territorial changes. For Napoleon, the campaign in Italy was more than a successful military operation. It provided an early demonstration of how fragmented political landscapes could be reorganized through a combination of strategy, negotiation, and administrative reform. The Italian states that had once operated independently now found themselves connected to the expanding influence of revolutionary France. Although this transformation affected only a portion of the continent, it hinted at a larger possibility. If similar methods were applied elsewhere, the traditional political map of Europe might be altered far more extensively than earlier generations had imagined. The victories in Italy changed Napoleon Bonaparte's position within France in ways that went far beyond the battlefield. Before the campaign, he had been known mainly inside military circles as a capable officer who had risen quickly during the Revolutionary Wars. After the campaign, he became a public figure whose name appeared regularly in reports, newspapers, and official proclamations. These reports often described the Italian victories not only as military successes, but also as signs that the French Republic had gained a commander capable of confronting the traditional powers of Europe. In a period when France was still struggling with internal instability, such achievements attracted considerable attention. The government that ruled France at this time, known as the Directory, relied heavily on the army to defend the revolution and maintain order. Yet the Directory itself faced growing difficulties. Political divisions within the country remained strong, economic problems persisted, and public confidence in the government was uneven. In this uncertain environment, successful generals gained influence because their victories provided both security and prestige for the Republic. Napoleon understood this political reality very well. During and after the Italian campaign, he carefully communicated his achievements to the government and to the French public. Bulletins describing the army's victories emphasized discipline, efficiency, and the benefits that the campaign had brought to France. These reports also portrayed Napoleon as a leader capable of guiding not only soldiers, but also political developments in the territories where French forces operated. His reputation, therefore, grew simultaneously in military and political spheres. At the same time, the experience of governing newly reorganized regions in Italy gave Napoleon an early opportunity to engage with questions that went beyond battlefield tactics. French authorities established several republics in northern Italy during the campaign, and their administration required coordination between military officers and civilian officials. Napoleon often played a direct role in negotiating treaties, organizing local governments, and determining how resources would be distributed. These responsibilities revealed that the success of revolutionary France abroad depended not only on winning battles, but also on creating political systems that could function under French influence. In effect, the Italian campaign became a laboratory in which military power and administrative reform were combined. For Napoleon personally, this experience broadened his understanding of how political authority could be exercised across different regions. He saw that fragmented territories could be reorganized quickly if military victories were followed by administrative changes. The same fragmented political landscape that had once protected Europe's balance of power could also allow a determined leader to reshape the system step by step. By the late 1790s, Napoleon had become aware that the revolutionary wars were opening possibilities that extended far beyond individual campaigns. His ambitions began to expand accordingly, yet the situation within France itself remained unstable. The Directory struggled to maintain consistent control over political factions, and many citizens were growing tired of the uncertainty that had followed nearly a decade of revolutionary upheaval. Some people hoped for a government that could provide stronger leadership and greater stability. Within this atmosphere, Napoleon's growing reputation as a decisive and successful commander attracted increasing interest from political leaders who believed that his authority might help strengthen the state. After returning from the Italian campaign, Napoleon continued to operate within the complex political environment of the Republic. His next expedition, to Egypt in 1798, aimed partly at challenging British influence in the eastern Mediterranean and partly at expanding French strategic options beyond Europe. Although the Egyptian campaign had mixed results, it kept Napoleon's name prominent in European politics and demonstrated his willingness to think on a large strategic scale. By the time he returned to France in 1799, the political situation had reached a critical point. Confidence in the Directory had declined, and several political figures began searching for a way to reorganize the government. Napoleon's popularity with the army and the public made him a central figure in these discussions. Later that year, a political upheaval known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire brought an end to the Directory and established a new government called the Consulate. Napoleon emerged from this transformation as first consul, effectively becoming the leading authority in France. This moment marked a turning point in his career. He was no longer simply a general fighting wars on behalf of the Republic. He had become the head of a government that possessed both military power and administrative authority. From this position, Napoleon would soon begin shaping policies that extended far beyond France's borders. The fragmented political landscape of Europe, combined with the revolutionary ideas that had spread during the previous decade, now stood before a leader who believed that the continent could be reorganized in ways that earlier generations had rarely imagined. When Napoleon Bonaparte became first consul of France in 1799, the wars that had begun during the French Revolution were still continuing across Europe. Several coalitions of European powers had already fought against France in an effort to contain the spread of revolutionary influence. Yet, the political situation was beginning to change. France now possessed a more stable government than it had during the earlier years of the Revolution, and Napoleon used this stability to reorganize both the army and the state. His government strengthened administrative institutions, improved financial management, and introduced legal reforms intended to create greater consistency across French territory. These internal changes were important because they allowed France to mobilize resources more efficiently than before. A government that could coordinate taxation, supply systems, and military planning with greater precision was also better prepared to conduct large campaigns beyond its borders. Napoleon did not immediately attempt to dominate the entire continent. During the first years of the consulate, he pursued a mixture of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation. France reached temporary agreements with some of its enemies, including the Treaty of Lunéville with Austria in 1801 and the Treaty of Amiens with Britain in 1802. For a brief moment, it appeared that Europe might move toward a period of relative calm after a decade of conflict. Yet the peace proved fragile. Rivalries between Britain and France soon resurfaced, and other European governments remained uneasy about the expanding influence of the French state. By 1803, war between Britain and France had resumed, and the political tension across the continent began to grow once again. Napoleon responded by strengthening the French army and preparing for the possibility of new coalitions forming against his government. During these years, he also transformed his own political position. In 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, creating a new imperial structure that replaced the earlier republican framework of the consulate. The ceremony took place in Paris in the presence of Pope Pius VII, though Napoleon famously placed the crown upon his own head, symbolizing that his authority derived not from traditional dynastic inheritance, but from the political transformations that had followed the revolution. The creation of the empire did not mean a return to the old systems of monarchy that had dominated Europe before 1789. Instead, Napoleon attempted to combine elements of imperial authority with many administrative reforms that had emerged from the revolutionary period. Under his rule, France maintained centralized government institutions, a professional bureaucracy, and legal reforms that emphasized uniform law. These internal structures would later serve as models for territories brought under French influence. Across Europe, other governments watched these developments with increasing concern. The rise of a new French empire suggested that Napoleon intended to extend his influence beyond the borders of France itself. By 1805, a new alliance, known as the Third Coalition, had formed against him. Austria, Russia, and Britain joined together with the aim of limiting French expansion and restoring the balance of power that had traditionally governed European politics. The coalition believed that if France were not stopped, the continent might eventually fall under the control of a single dominant state. Napoleon's response to this challenge demonstrated the strategic abilities that had already been visible during the Italian campaign. Rather than waiting for enemy forces to concentrate against him, he moved his armies rapidly across Central Europe. His troops crossed the Rhine and advanced toward the Austrian territories along the Danube. In a series of maneuvers and engagements during the autumn of 1805, French forces surrounded and defeated an Austrian army at Ulm, capturing thousands of soldiers and weakening the coalition's position before the main battle had even begun. This early success opened the road toward one of the most significant confrontations of the Napoleonic Wars. In December of that same year, near the town of Austerlitz in what is now the Czech Republic, Napoleon's army would face the combined forces of Austria and Russia. The battle that followed would become one of the most famous military victories of the era, and its consequences would reshape the political map of Europe. In the early winter of 1805, the armies of Europe gathered near the small Moravian town of Austerlitz in a landscape of gentle hills and frozen fields. Napoleon's forces, numbering around 70,000 soldiers, faced a larger combined army of Russian and Austrian troops, commanded by Emperor Alexander I of Russia and Emperor Francis II of Austria. On paper, the coalition army possessed an advantage in numbers, yet the outcome of the coming battle would depend not only on the size of the forces, but on how they were used across the terrain. Napoleon studied the ground carefully and began shaping a plan that relied on timing, deception, and the careful movement of his troops. In the days before the battle, he deliberately allowed parts of his position to appear weak. The coalition commanders, believing that Napoleon's army might be vulnerable on its right flank, prepared to launch a large attack in that direction. Their plan aimed to push the French forces away from the road connecting them to Vienna, potentially cutting Napoleon off from his lines of communication. What the coalition leaders did not fully anticipate was that Napoleon had already considered this possibility. By encouraging them to focus their attention on the French right flank, he created an opportunity elsewhere on the battlefield. On the morning of the 2nd of December, 1805, as the coalition armies began their advance, the center of their formation gradually became thinner. At that moment, Napoleon ordered a powerful attack toward a plateau known as the Pratzen Heights, a key position overlooking the battlefield. French troops moved forward with speed and coordination, breaking through the weakened center of the coalition army. Once the heights were captured, the coalition forces found themselves divided, with parts of their army separated and unable to support one another effectively. The battle unfolded through a series of engagements across the frozen countryside, but the turning point remained the seizure of the Pratzen Heights. As the day progressed, French forces pressed their advantage, pushing segments of the coalition army back toward frozen lakes and narrow roads crowded with retreating soldiers and artillery. By the end of the battle, the combined Austrian and Russian forces had suffered heavy losses, while Napoleon's army maintained control of the field. The victory at Austerlitz quickly became known as one of Napoleon's most remarkable military achievements. Yet the significance of the battle extended far beyond the immediate outcome. Within weeks, Austria sought peace negotiations with France. The resulting agreement, the Treaty of Pressburg, imposed significant territorial changes. Austria ceded lands in Italy and in the German-speaking regions of Central Europe to states allied with France. These adjustments altered the balance of power in the region and strengthened Napoleon's influence among several German territories. One of the most important consequences of the campaign followed shortly afterward. For centuries, the Holy Roman Empire had existed as a loose political structure that linked hundreds of German states under the nominal authority of an emperor. In practice, its power had long been limited, yet the institution still represented a historical framework that dated back to the medieval period. After the defeat of Austria and the political changes imposed by Napoleon, this ancient structure could no longer survive in its previous form. In 1806, Emperor Francis II formally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, bringing an end to an institution that had existed for nearly 1,000 years. The disappearance of the empire did not simply remove an old title from European politics. It opened the way for a new arrangement of German states that would operate under French influence. Napoleon soon organized many of these territories into a political grouping known as the Confederation of the Rhine. Several German rulers joined this confederation, aligning themselves with France and accepting a new regional structure that replaced the fragmented imperial system. Through these developments, the victory at Austerlitz contributed directly to a transformation of Central Europe. The continent that had once been divided into hundreds of overlapping jurisdictions began to reorganize itself into larger political units connected to the expanding power of Napoleon's empire. After the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, the political landscape of Central Europe entered a new phase. For centuries, the German-speaking regions of the continent had existed within a framework that linked hundreds of territories under the loose authority of an imperial structure. Although that system had weakened long before Napoleon's rise, it still provided a historical reference point that shaped diplomatic relations and political identities. When the empire disappeared, the space it had once occupied did not remain empty for long. Napoleon moved quickly to reorganize many of these territories into a new arrangement that would operate under French influence while maintaining the appearance of local sovereignty. This new structure became known as the Confederation of the Rhine. The Confederation was formed through agreements between France and a number of German rulers who chose to withdraw from the old imperial system and align themselves with Napoleon's empire. States such as Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and several smaller principalities joined the Confederation in exchange for political recognition and territorial adjustments that strengthened their positions. In many cases, these rulers gained new lands or titles as a result of their alliance with France. Some territories were elevated from duchies to kingdoms, reflecting the new hierarchy emerging within Napoleon's system. While the member states retained their own governments, they accepted obligations that connected them closely to French policy. One of the most important of these obligations involved military cooperation. The states of the Confederation of the Rhine agreed to provide troops to support Napoleon's campaigns when requested. In this way, the Confederation became both a political alliance and a strategic network that extended French influence across Central Europe. At the same time, the new structure reduced the ability of Austria and Prussia to dominate the German-speaking regions, as they had attempted to do in earlier centuries. The reorganization of these territories therefore reshaped the balance of power within the continent. Alongside these diplomatic arrangements, administrative and legal reforms began to spread through parts of the Confederation. Some rulers adopted elements of the legal and governmental systems that had developed in France during the revolutionary period. Reforms included changes to taxation, reductions in certain feudal obligations, and the modernization of state administration. Although each territory applied these reforms in its own way, the broader pattern reflected a shift toward more centralized and standardized governance. The spread of such policies demonstrated that Napoleon's influence was not limited to battlefield victories. His empire also functioned as a mechanism through which political institutions were gradually reshaped in multiple regions. Observers across Europe recognized that something unusual was taking place. For generations, the continent had been organized through a balance of independent states, whose borders and alliances shifted gradually through diplomacy and occasional wars. Now, however, the map was being altered more rapidly. Regions that had once been divided among many small jurisdictions were being reorganized into larger political units connected through alliances with France. The Confederation of the Rhine was one of the clearest examples of this transformation. It did not create a unified Germany, but it did simplify a political landscape that had once contained hundreds of separate authorities. This process also strengthened Napoleon's position as the central figure in continental politics. With the French Empire at its core and allied states surrounding it, his system extended across a wide portion of Europe. From the Atlantic coast to the borders of Poland, governments now had to consider how their decisions would interact with the expanding network of territories aligned with France. Some rulers chose cooperation, believing that alignment with Napoleon offered security or advantage. Others began searching for ways to resist what they increasingly viewed as an emerging continental system dominated by French power. By the middle of the first decade of the 19th century, Europe had begun to look very different from the fragmented continent that had existed only a generation earlier. The old imperial structures had been dismantled, new political alliances had appeared, and the influence of one government now reached across multiple regions. These developments did not yet represent a fully unified Europe, but they suggested that the continent was moving toward a new kind of political arrangement. The system taking shape around Napoleon's empire would soon expand even further, as new wars and diplomatic changes carried French influence into additional territories. By the time Napoleon's influence stretched across much of continental Europe, his power was no longer expressed only through military victories or diplomatic alliances. Another transformation was taking place more quietly, through the spread of legal and administrative reforms that reshaped how governments functioned within the territories connected to his empire. For centuries, many parts of Europe had operated under legal systems that were deeply uneven. Laws varied from province to province, privileges depended on social rank, and local customs often determined how justice was administered. Nobles, clergy, merchants, and peasants could be subject to different rules depending on the traditions of a particular region. These differences were not accidental. They had developed slowly through medieval institutions and feudal relationships that tied legal authority to inherited status. By the late 18th century, this complex mixture of laws made governance difficult, especially in territories where multiple jurisdictions overlapped. One of Napoleon's most enduring reforms attempted to address this problem through the creation of a unified legal framework. In 1804, the French government introduced the Civil Code, often called the Napoleonic Code. The purpose of this legal system was to replace many older and conflicting laws with a clear and consistent set of principles that would apply across the territory governed by France. The code drew upon several intellectual traditions, including Roman law and ideas developed during the French Revolution. Its central principle was that citizens should be equal before the law, regardless of their birth or social background. Property rights were defined more precisely, contracts were regulated under standardized rules, and the authority of the state was separated from many forms of religious jurisdiction that had once influenced legal decisions. For a society accustomed to legal fragmentation, this represented a significant change. Instead of navigating dozens of regional customs, judges and officials could rely on a single code that outlined how civil disputes should be resolved. Within France, the adoption of the Civil Code helped strengthen the centralized administrative system that had developed during the revolutionary period. Courts applied uniform procedures, and the government could coordinate legal decisions more consistently across different departments of the country. Napoleon viewed this reform as one of the most important achievements of his rule. While military victories could shift borders temporarily, a legal system had the potential to shape society for generations. As French armies moved across Europe, this legal framework began to spread into territories that came under French control or influence. In regions along the Rhine, in parts of Italy, and in the Low Countries, administrators introduced versions of the civil code as part of broader reforms designed to modernize government institutions. The adoption of these laws often accompanied other administrative changes, such as reorganized taxation systems, standardized bureaucratic procedures, and the removal of certain feudal obligations that had tied peasants to landowners. These reforms were not applied everywhere in exactly the same way. Some local rulers adopted them willingly because they believed that clearer legal systems could strengthen their states. Others accepted them because they were part of treaties with France, or because French military presence made resistance difficult. In either case, the spread of the Napoleonic legal framework demonstrated that Napoleon's influence was not limited to political alliances or battlefield victories. His empire also operated as a vehicle through which new legal principles traveled across the continent. In several regions, the replacement of feudal privileges with standardized laws altered the relationship between governments and their populations. Individuals who had once been subject to local noble authority found themselves living under legal systems that treated them as citizens within a state structure. Although these changes did not eliminate inequality or conflict, they introduced a more predictable framework for governance. By the early 19th century, large areas of continental Europe were beginning to share similar legal concepts regarding property, contracts, and civil rights. Through these developments, Napoleon's empire began to shape Europe not only by redrawing borders, but also by redefining the rules through which societies organized themselves. As Napoleon's influence expanded across the European continent, the legal reforms introduced in France did not remain confined within its borders. They gradually appeared in many territories connected to the French Empire, often accompanying broader administrative changes. In regions such as northern Italy, the Rhineland, and the Low Countries, local governments began adopting legal principles derived from the French civil code. The process was not always identical in each place, but the general direction was similar. Older legal systems that had relied heavily on feudal traditions, local privileges, and overlapping jurisdictions were slowly replaced by more centralized and standardized frameworks. For administrators responsible for governing large territories, this change offered practical advantages. A consistent legal structure made it easier to collect taxes, regulate commerce, and coordinate judicial decisions across different regions. In this sense, the spread of Napoleonic legal reforms was closely tied to the broader effort to create more efficient states. One of the most noticeable effects of these reforms was the gradual reduction of feudal obligations that had long shaped rural life in many parts of Europe. Under older systems, peasants in certain regions were required to perform labor services or provide payments to landowners as part of traditional arrangements dating back centuries. These obligations varied widely depending on local customs, and they often limited the economic independence of rural communities. In several territories influenced by Napoleon's administration, reforms abolished or reduced many of these duties. Peasants were increasingly recognized as individuals who could own property, sign contracts, and participate in economic life under standardized legal protections. While these changes did not eliminate social inequality, they did alter the legal foundation upon which rural society had been organized. Landowners and nobles still retained wealth and influence, but their authority was no longer supported by the same system of inherited legal privileges. Urban administration also experienced transformation during this period. Many cities adopted new forms of municipal organization inspired by French models. Local officials were often appointed within a structured hierarchy that connected municipal governments to regional administrators and ultimately to central authority. This system allowed policies to be implemented with greater consistency across wide areas. Roads, taxation systems, and public institutions could be coordinated more effectively when governments operated within similar administrative frameworks. In territories such as the Kingdom of Italy, which Napoleon created in 1805 and ruled through a combination of French officials and local elites, these reforms were applied with particular emphasis. Administrative districts were reorganized, and courts began operating under standardized procedures influenced by the civil code. Similar developments occurred in the German territories that belonged to the Confederation of the Rhine. Some rulers adopted these reforms willingly because they saw them as tools for strengthening their own governments. By modernizing administration and reducing the complexity of feudal legal traditions, they could increase the authority of the state and improve economic management within their territories. Not all reactions to these changes were positive. In certain areas, people viewed the reforms as part of a broader system of foreign influence imposed by France. Even when legal reforms offered practical benefits, they were often introduced alongside military occupation or political pressure. As a result, acceptance varied widely depending on local conditions. Some communities welcomed the removal of feudal obligations or the creation of more predictable legal systems. Others resented the presence of French officials and the expectation that their governments would supply troops and resources to support Napoleon's wars. This mixture of reform and resistance became a defining feature of the Napoleonic era. Nevertheless, the long-term effects of these administrative and legal changes proved significant. By the early 19th century, several regions that had once been governed through fragmented legal traditions were operating under systems that resembled one another more closely than before. Standardized laws, professional bureaucracies, and centralized administration created conditions that allowed governments to function with greater coordination across large territories. Even after Napoleon's empire eventually collapsed, many of these reforms remained in place because they had demonstrated practical advantages for governance. In this way, the Napoleonic system reshaped Europe not only through military expansion, but also through the quieter transformation of how law and administration operated within the societies connected to his empire. As these legal and administrative reforms spread across territories connected to Napoleon's empire, a subtle but important question began to emerge across Europe. For centuries, the continent had been defined by differences in law, custom, and political authority. Travelers moving across regions could encounter entirely different legal traditions within a short distance. Contracts might be interpreted differently, property rights could vary widely, and courts often relied on local precedents that had developed over generations. Under the influence of Napoleon's reforms, however, many of these differences began to narrow. In places where the Napoleonic Code was adopted, citizens increasingly operated under similar legal principles, regardless of the specific territory in which they lived. This development did not immediately create political unity, but it did introduce a form of legal consistency that had rarely existed on such a scale within Europe. The significance of this shift becomes clearer when considering how states traditionally organized authority. Under the older systems of the old regime, law often reinforced social hierarchy. Nobles possessed privileges that distinguished them from common citizens, and certain institutions were governed by religious authorities rather than by the state. Napoleon's legal reforms attempted to replace these distinctions with a system in which the state acted as the central source of law. Courts applied rules written in a standardized code, and officials were expected to interpret these rules in consistent ways. For individuals living within territories that adopted these reforms, the change could be noticeable in everyday matters such as property ownership, inheritance, and commercial agreements. Merchants conducting business across regional boundaries encountered legal frameworks that resembled one another more closely than before, which helped reduce some of the uncertainty that had complicated trade in earlier centuries. In this sense, Napoleon's empire began to create conditions that allowed parts of the continent to function within a more integrated legal environment. At the same time, the political meaning of these reforms remained complex. Although many of the principles behind the Napoleonic Code had emerged from the ideals of the French Revolution, their spread was closely connected to the expansion of French power. Laws that promised equality before the state were often introduced by governments that had been reorganized under French influence or established through Napoleon's authority. As a result, some Europeans viewed these reforms as signs of modernization, while others interpreted them as instruments of imperial control. The same legal code could therefore be seen in two different ways, depending on one's perspective. To some observers, the reforms represented progress toward more rational and efficient systems of governance. To others, they symbolized the growing reach of a political system centered in Paris. This tension reflected the broader character of the Napoleonic era. Napoleon was not attempting to create a democratic federation of European states in the modern sense. His empire remained a hierarchical system in which France held the dominant position. Yet the administrative and legal structures associated with his rule introduced patterns that connected multiple regions through similar institutions. Courts, bureaucracies, and administrative districts in several territories began to operate according to principles that had originated in France but were now applied across wider areas. Over time, these similarities influenced how people understood the organization of political authority. Even those who opposed Napoleon's dominance could not ignore the practical effects of the reforms that accompanied his expansion. When later generations of Europeans debated how states should be governed, they often referred back to the administrative clarity and legal consistency that had emerged during this period. In this way, the Napoleonic system produced an outcome that extended beyond the immediate ambitions of the empire itself. By spreading uniform legal principles across large parts of the continent, it demonstrated that European societies could operate within shared institutional frameworks. The experiment was imperfect and often controversial, yet it revealed that the political landscape of Europe was capable of being reorganized in ways that earlier centuries had rarely imagined. The empire Napoleon constructed still relied heavily on military power and political alliances, but beneath these visible structures lay a quieter transformation in how law and administration connected different regions of the continent. By the early years of the 19th century, Napoleon's influence extended across a wide portion of continental Europe. French armies had defeated several coalitions, allied states surrounded the French Empire, and legal reforms were spreading through territories connected to his system. Yet one powerful rival remained largely beyond his reach. Across the English Channel, Great Britain continued to oppose French expansion with a strength that did not depend primarily on armies moving across land. Britain's power rested heavily on its navy and its growing commercial network that linked Europe to markets around the world. British ships dominated major sea routes, and British merchants traded goods with ports across the continent. Even when Napoleon's armies achieved victories on land, Britain remained capable of financing coalitions against France and maintaining its economic influence. This situation created a strategic challenge for Napoleon. If he could not defeat Britain through direct invasion, he would have to weaken it through other means. The result was an ambitious attempt to reshape the economic relationships of Europe. In 1806, Napoleon announced a policy that became known as the Continental System. The idea behind it was relatively straightforward. If the ports of continental Europe were closed to British goods, Britain would lose access to one of its most important markets. Without the ability to sell manufactured products across the continent or import certain resources from European ports, the British economy might suffer severe pressure. Napoleon believed that such economic isolation could eventually force Britain to negotiate peace with France. To implement this plan, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree in November 1806 after his victories against Prussia. The decree declared the British Isles to be under blockade and prohibited trade between Britain and territories under French control. In theory, this meant that ships carrying British goods were not allowed to enter European ports connected to Napoleon's empire. Merchants were forbidden from importing British products, and goods originating from Britain could be confiscated by authorities if discovered. Over time, additional regulations strengthened the policy, extending the restrictions to more territories aligned with France. The success of such a system depended on cooperation from a wide range of governments across the continent. States within the Confederation of the Rhine, the Kingdom of Italy, and other Allied territories were expected to follow the restrictions on British trade. In addition, Napoleon pressured neutral countries and neighboring powers to join the system or face political consequences. Through diplomacy and military influence, he attempted to create a broad economic barrier stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. If successful, this barrier would transform the continent into a market largely closed to British commerce. The continental system, therefore, represented more than a wartime blockade. It was an effort to coordinate the economic behavior of multiple European states within a single framework. In practice, this required governments across the continent to regulate their ports, inspect cargo, and enforce trade rules that aligned with French policy. Such coordination was difficult to achieve, especially across regions with different economic interests and long-established trading patterns. Many ports had relied on commerce with Britain for decades, and merchants often found ways to continue trading despite official prohibitions. Smuggling became widespread along certain coastlines, while some governments quietly relaxed enforcement when economic pressures became too severe. Despite these difficulties, the continental system revealed something important about Napoleon's vision of continental power. His earlier campaigns had reorganized the political map of Europe and introduced legal reforms across several regions. Now he was attempting to reshape the economic relationships that connected those regions to the wider world. If trade across the continent could be directed through policies coordinated by his empire, then Europe might begin to function as a more integrated economic space. The attempt to isolate Britain, therefore, carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate war. It suggested that the European continent could, at least in theory, operate within a shared economic structure guided by decisions made at the center of Napoleon's system. As the continental system expanded after 1806, its success depended on something far more complicated than issuing decrees from Paris. The idea of closing the entire European coastline to British trade required the cooperation of dozens of governments, administrators, port officials, and merchants scattered across a vast geographical space. From the harbors of the Baltic Sea to the ports of Italy and Spain, authorities were expected to inspect cargo, control shipping routes, and prevent British goods from entering continental markets. On paper, the system appeared powerful. Napoleon's empire and its allied states controlled an enormous stretch of coastline. Yet the practical challenge of enforcing economic restrictions across such a wide area quickly became apparent. Europe's commercial life had developed over centuries through networks that were difficult to interrupt overnight. British textiles, manufactured goods, and colonial products had long circulated through continental markets. Merchants, ship captains, and traders had built relationships that connected ports across the North Sea, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean. When the continental system attempted to cut these connections, many individuals began searching for ways to continue their trade despite the official rules. Smuggling became one of the most visible consequences. Along coastlines where supervision was limited, small vessels quietly transported goods between British ships and continental ports. In certain regions, entire communities became involved in these informal trading networks. Goods might be landed on remote beaches, transported inland through local markets, and eventually sold as if they had originated elsewhere. Authorities tried to prevent such activities through inspections and penalties, but the sheer length of Europe's coastline made complete enforcement extremely difficult. In northern Germany, in the Low Countries, and along parts of the Mediterranean coast, reports of smuggling appeared frequently. Even some officials responsible for enforcing the system occasionally turned a blind eye when economic pressures became too strong. The policy also produced unexpected effects on the economies of continental Europe. Some industries benefited from the absence of British competition. Textile manufacturers in certain regions, for example, found new opportunities because British imports were no longer officially available in local markets. At the same time, other sectors suffered from the sudden disruption of established trade routes. Merchants who had depended on British goods struggled to find alternative suppliers, and certain ports experienced a decline in commercial activity. The economic landscape of the continent, therefore, became uneven. While some regions adapted to the new system, others faced difficulties that led to frustration with the restrictions imposed by Napoleon's government. The continental system also influenced relations between France and other European powers. Countries that had previously tried to remain neutral in the conflict between France and Britain found themselves under increasing pressure to choose a side. Napoleon expected his allies to enforce the trade restrictions strictly, but not all governments were equally willing to do so. Some rulers worried that the economic consequences of cutting ties with Britain might weaken their own states. In response, Napoleon sometimes responded with diplomatic pressure or military intervention to ensure compliance. The attempt to regulate trade across such a large region, therefore, became closely connected to the broader political structure of his empire. Economic policy and political authority began to reinforce one another. Through these developments, the continental system gradually revealed both the possibilities and the limits of Napoleon's attempt to shape Europe as a coordinated system. For the first time in modern history, a large portion of the continent was expected to follow a shared economic policy designed to serve a strategic goal. The effort demonstrated that European economies were already diverse societies with different interests. The continent could be influenced by a single system, but maintaining that system required constant political and administrative effort. The continental system, therefore, became one of the most ambitious experiments of Napoleon's era, an attempt not only to defeat a rival power, but also to organize the economic behavior of an entire continent under a common strategy. As the continental system continued to operate across Europe, observers gradually began to recognize that it represented more than a temporary wartime measure. At its surface, the policy was designed to weaken Britain by denying it access to continental markets. Yet the practical steps required to enforce the system began to reshape the economic relationships between European regions themselves. Ports that had once traded freely with British merchants were now expected to look inward toward the continent. Governments coordinated customs regulations, monitored shipping, and attempted to control the movement of goods through shared policies. In doing so, they unintentionally created a situation in which large parts of Europe were operating within a loosely connected economic framework directed from the center of Napoleon's empire. For centuries, European economies had interacted through trade, but they had not been coordinated under a single strategy. Each kingdom or state set its own tariffs, managed its own ports, and negotiated its own commercial treaties. The continental system temporarily altered that pattern. Instead of dozens of separate trade policies operating independently, Napoleon attempted to impose a common rule: British goods were to be excluded from continental markets. This rule required states across Europe to adjust their economic behavior in similar ways. Officials in Hamburg, Milan, Amsterdam, and other major trading centers found themselves implementing regulations that reflected the same overarching policy. While the system did not erase national boundaries, it did encourage governments to act within a shared framework that connected their economic decisions. Some historians later observed that this moment revealed how closely the economies of Europe were already linked. When trade with Britain was restricted, shortages and price changes could be felt across multiple regions. Merchants searched for alternative supply routes, manufacturers adjusted production to meet new demands, and governments experimented with policies designed to stabilize local markets. The continent began to respond to economic pressures, not as isolated territories but as parts of a wider network influenced by the same regulations. Napoleon himself recognized the potential advantages of this arrangement. If the economies of continental Europe could be directed toward cooperation under French leadership, the continent might develop a degree of independence from British maritime commerce. In theory, such a system would strengthen the position of France and its allies, while reducing Britain's ability to influence European markets. Yet, the experiment remained incomplete and often unstable. The economic interests of different regions were not identical. Some areas depended heavily on colonial goods that Britain supplied through its naval trade networks. Others relied on exporting agricultural products or raw materials through ports that had long maintained commercial relationships with British merchants. When these connections were disrupted, local economies sometimes struggled to adapt. Smuggling continued to undermine official regulations, and enforcement required constant effort from administrators across the continent. Over time, the continental system also began to strain relations between Napoleon and some of his allies. Governments that had initially cooperated with the policy sometimes found themselves facing economic hardship as a result of the restrictions. In certain cases, rulers quietly relaxed enforcement or allowed limited trade to continue despite official decrees. Napoleon often responded by tightening regulations or expanding French control over additional territories in order to protect the system. These actions revealed how closely economic policy had become tied to political authority within his empire. Maintaining a continent-wide trade blockade required not only regulations, but also the power to enforce them across multiple states. The continental system therefore revealed both the ambition and the limitations of Napoleon's broader vision for Europe. On one level, it was clearly a strategic attempt to defeat Britain through economic pressure. On another level, it demonstrated how the continent could begin to function as a coordinated economic space when governments followed shared rules. The experiment did not produce a stable or lasting economic union, yet it illustrated the possibility that Europe's economies could be influenced by policies operating across borders. In the years that followed, new conflicts and political developments would test the durability of Napoleon's system. Even as the continental system struggled to achieve its original goal, it revealed that the idea of organizing the continent through common economic policies was no longer purely theoretical. The attempt had already begun to reshape how Europeans thought about the connections between their markets, their governments, and the wider balance of power that defined the age of Napoleon. By the middle of the first decade of the 19th century, Napoleon's influence across Europe had grown so extensive that military victories alone were no longer enough to maintain control. Territories connected to the French Empire required governments that could administer laws, collect taxes, and coordinate policies with Paris. Rather than ruling every region directly from France, Napoleon developed another method to stabilize his expanding system. In several parts of Europe, he placed trusted relatives and loyal allies on newly created or reorganized thrones. These rulers were expected to govern their kingdoms while remaining closely aligned with the political and military objectives of the French Empire. Through this arrangement, Napoleon attempted to create a network of states that were formally independent but strategically connected to his authority. One of the earliest examples appeared in Italy. After the French campaigns that had transformed the political map of the peninsula, Napoleon reorganized several Italian territories into new political structures. In 1805, he established the Kingdom of Italy, a state that was closely tied to France and governed under institutions influenced by French administrative reforms. Napoleon himself became the king of this new kingdom, while his stepson, Eugène de Beauharnais, served as viceroy and managed daily governance. Under this arrangement, Italian territories that had once been divided among multiple dynasties now operated within a political framework linked directly to Napoleon's empire. Similar developments followed in other regions. In 1806, Napoleon created the Kingdom of Holland and placed his brother Louis Bonaparte on its throne. The Netherlands had long been an important commercial region with strong maritime traditions and international trade connections. By installing a member of his own family as ruler, Napoleon hoped to ensure that Dutch policies would support the continental system and restrict British commerce along the North Sea coast. The arrangement also allowed France to extend its strategic influence over ports that had historically played key roles in European trade networks. Not long afterward, another new kingdom emerged within the German territories, reorganized after the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. The Kingdom of Westphalia was established in 1807 and placed under the rule of Napoleon's younger brother, Jérôme Bonaparte. Unlike some older monarchies, Westphalia was designed from the beginning as a state influenced by Napoleonic reforms. Its government adopted modern administrative structures and introduced legal principles inspired by the Napoleonic Code. Feudal privileges were reduced, and administrative districts were reorganized to operate under centralized authority. For Napoleon, Westphalia represented an opportunity to demonstrate how a newly created state could function according to the political and legal ideas associated with his empire. The system extended further when Napoleon placed another relative, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne of Naples in southern Italy. Joseph had previously served in diplomatic and administrative roles within the French government, and Napoleon believed that his brother's loyalty would help stabilize the region under French influence. Through these appointments, the political map of Europe gradually filled with governments ruled by members of the Bonaparte family or by leaders closely connected to them. Each kingdom retained its own identity, yet its policies were expected to align with the broader objectives of Napoleon's continental system. This arrangement reflected Napoleon's attempt to balance two goals at once. On one hand, he wished to maintain control over strategic regions of Europe and ensure that Allied governments supported his military and economic policies. On the other hand, he recognized that local populations were more likely to accept rulers who appeared to govern their own states rather than direct administrators from France. By placing relatives and loyal allies on European thrones, Napoleon hoped to create a network of monarchies that would cooperate with one another while remaining connected to the authority of his empire. The experiment suggested a new way of organizing political power across the continent, one in which multiple kingdoms operated within a system shaped by a single dominant leader. As these new kingdoms began to function within Napoleon's expanding system, the rulers placed on their thrones faced a complicated task. They were expected to govern as sovereign monarchs within their own territories, yet at the same time they were closely tied to the strategic interests of the French Empire. This arrangement created a delicate balance between local administration and imperial loyalty. Each kingdom possessed its own traditions, social structures, and economic conditions, which meant that the reforms associated with Napoleon could not always be applied in exactly the same way everywhere. The rulers he installed, whether family members or trusted allies, had to navigate the expectations of Paris while also responding to the realities of the societies they governed. In many of these states, administrative reforms were introduced that reflected the broader principles of the Napoleonic system. Governments reorganized their bureaucracies, established clearer systems of taxation, and modernized legal institutions based on the civil code. Officials were appointed to oversee districts, courts applied standardized procedures, and the authority of the state was strengthened relative to older feudal structures. These changes were particularly visible in the Kingdom of Westphalia, which had been created almost entirely from territories reorganized after the dissolution of earlier political structures. Its constitution incorporated elements of Napoleonic law, reduced the privileges of the traditional aristocracy, and introduced administrative divisions similar to those used in France. In theory, Westphalia was meant to represent a modernized European state, influenced by revolutionary principles, but governed under a monarchy loyal to Napoleon. Other kingdoms experienced similar adjustments, though the process often proved more complicated in practice. In the Kingdom of Holland, for example, Louis Bonaparte soon discovered that governing a commercially active society required careful attention to local interests. Dutch merchants and officials had long traditions of economic independence and international trade. When Napoleon demanded strict enforcement of the continental system, Louis sometimes hesitated to apply policies that might damage the Dutch economy. This tension illustrated the challenges faced by rulers who were both members of Napoleon's family and sovereigns responsible for their own populations. Their loyalty to the empire did not always align perfectly with the needs of their states. At the same time, the kingdoms within Napoleon's network were expected to contribute resources to the broader military campaigns that continued across Europe. Troops from the Confederation of the Rhine, from Italy, and from other Allied states joined French forces in major battles and campaigns. These armies fought under their own flags, but were coordinated as part of Napoleon's strategic planning. In effect, the empire functioned as a system in which multiple states provided soldiers, supplies, and administrative support to maintain the power of the whole. This arrangement extended the reach of French influence while reducing the need for direct rule over every territory. Yet the system also revealed its limitations as time passed. Local populations sometimes viewed the new monarchs as representatives of foreign authority rather than as legitimate national rulers. Even when reforms brought practical improvements in administration or law, the association with French military power could provoke resistance. In Spain and parts of Italy, tensions would soon grow into open conflict. Elsewhere, governments tried to maintain stability by adjusting how strictly they implemented Napoleon's policies. The experience of these kingdoms demonstrated that organizing Europe through a network of allied monarchies was both innovative and fragile. It allowed Napoleon to project power across a wide geographic space, linking different regions through shared political and military structures. At the same time, it required constant negotiation between imperial ambition and local realities. Rulers placed on these thrones had to balance loyalty to Napoleon with the expectations of the societies they governed, a task that would become increasingly difficult as the pressures of war and economic strain continued to grow across the continent. As Napoleon's network of allied kingdoms expanded across Europe, the system began to reveal both its strength and its vulnerability. At first, placing relatives and trusted allies on European thrones seemed to provide a practical solution for governing a vast and diverse continent. These rulers could implement reforms, maintain administrative order, and coordinate with the policies of the French Empire. From Paris, the arrangement appeared to create a stable structure in which multiple kingdoms operated within a single strategic framework. Yet the deeper the system spread into European societies, the more it encountered traditions, loyalties, and identities that could not easily be reshaped by decree. Many of the territories incorporated into Napoleon's system possessed long histories that shaped how people understood authority and political legitimacy. Dynasties that had ruled for generations were suddenly replaced by new monarchs connected to a foreign emperor. Even when these rulers introduced legal reforms or administrative improvements, their association with French power often influenced how local populations perceived them. In some regions, the changes were accepted with caution or even curiosity, particularly where feudal obligations had been burdensome. In other places, however, the arrival of a new dynasty linked to Napoleon was viewed as an intrusion into established traditions. Spain would soon provide one of the clearest examples of this tension, though similar feelings could also be detected in parts of Germany and Italy. The challenge was not only political, but also cultural. Napoleon's empire functioned according to principles that had emerged from the French Revolution and the administrative reforms of the consulate. These principles emphasized centralized authority, standardized laws, and governments that operated through organized bureaucracies. In many areas of Europe, however, political life had long been shaped by local institutions, regional privileges, and historical arrangements that connected communities to older forms of authority. When Napoleonic reforms replaced these traditions with new systems designed in Paris or by French officials, the changes sometimes produced unease among populations who felt that their own political heritage was being altered too quickly. At the same time, the system of allied kingdoms required constant military support. Napoleon's campaigns continued across different parts of the continent, and the states within his network were expected to provide soldiers and resources to sustain these operations. As wars grew larger and more demanding, the populations of these states increasingly felt the weight of conscription, taxation, and economic regulation connected to the empire. Even rulers loyal to Napoleon sometimes struggled to balance the expectations placed upon them by France with the pressures felt by their own societies. These difficulties slowly revealed a contradiction within the structure Napoleon had created. His system relied on the cooperation of many European states, yet it also depended on the authority of a single dominant power. The kingdoms ruled by his relatives were meant to appear independent, but their policies were closely linked to decisions made within the French Empire. Over time, this imbalance became more visible to people living within those states. What had initially appeared to be a network of allied monarchies began to look, in the eyes of some observers, like an expanding imperial structure centered on France. Yet the story did not end simply with resistance. The reforms introduced during this period also produced unexpected effects that would shape Europe's future in more complex ways. In several regions, the administrative changes and legal reforms associated with Napoleon contributed to the development of stronger and more centralized states. At the same time, the experience of foreign domination encouraged new discussions about national identity and political independence. Intellectuals, officials, and ordinary citizens alike began to reflect on what it meant to belong to a particular people or nation within the broader landscape of Europe. These reflections did not immediately overturn Napoleon's system, but they planted ideas that would continue to grow in the decades that followed. The network of kingdoms ruled by Napoleon's relatives, therefore, represented more than a temporary political arrangement. It became part of a larger transformation in which European societies were simultaneously experiencing administrative modernization and the early stirrings of national consciousness. As long as Napoleon's armies remained strong, this system could function despite its internal tensions. But beneath the surface, the reactions it provoked were slowly preparing the continent for a new phase of conflict that would challenge the very structure he had built. By the time Napoleon's influence reached its greatest extent across Europe, the continent was experiencing a transformation that few people had anticipated at the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars. The French Empire and its allied states now formed a political system stretching from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Eastern Europe. Legal reforms had spread across several regions. Governments had been reorganized, and new monarchies connected to Napoleon's authority ruled territories that had once belonged to older dynasties. From a strategic perspective, this arrangement appeared to place much of continental Europe within a single political framework. Yet, beneath the surface of this system, a different reaction was slowly emerging among many of the populations living under or near French influence. Instead of dissolving older loyalties, Napoleon's expansion sometimes strengthened them. Communities that had previously identified mainly with local rulers or regional traditions began to think more consciously about collective identity, language, and shared history. In several parts of Europe, these reflections gradually developed into new forms of national awareness. Spain became one of the first places where this change became visible on a large scale. In 1808, a political crisis within the Spanish monarchy created an opportunity for Napoleon to extend his influence more directly into the Iberian Peninsula. After a series of negotiations and pressures, the Spanish king Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII both abdicated their claims to the throne. Napoleon then placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain, expecting that the country would join the broader system of allied states already established elsewhere in Europe. The decision appeared consistent with the pattern Napoleon had followed in other territories, yet the reaction in Spain was very different from what he had encountered in places such as northern Italy or the Rhineland. Many Spanish communities interpreted the installation of Joseph Bonaparte as a violation of their political traditions and national independence. Resistance began almost immediately in several regions, with local uprisings forming against the new government. These movements did not always operate as organized national armies. Instead, groups of civilians, local militias, and irregular fighters began to conduct small-scale attacks against French troops and administrative officials. Over time, these actions developed into what became known as guerrilla warfare, a form of conflict in which smaller forces used mobility and knowledge of the local terrain to challenge larger armies. French troops could win battles against organized opponents, but controlling a country where resistance appeared across villages, roads, and mountain regions proved far more difficult. The conflict in Spain soon expanded into a prolonged struggle known as the Peninsular War. British forces under commanders such as Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, joined Spanish and Portuguese armies in opposing French control of the peninsula. What began as a political intervention by Napoleon gradually turned into one of the most demanding military conflicts of his empire. French armies remained strong, but they were required to commit large numbers of soldiers to maintain their presence in a region where resistance rarely disappeared completely. The events in Spain demonstrated that Napoleon's system of allied monarchies could encounter powerful opposition when local populations believed that their political independence or cultural identity was under threat. At the same time, the experience of resistance encouraged new discussions about the meaning of nationhood. In Spain, leaders of the resistance movement organized assemblies that attempted to represent the Spanish nation during the absence of the traditional monarchy. These discussions combined older loyalties to the crown with emerging ideas about national sovereignty that had been influenced by the earlier revolutionary period. The result was a political movement that blended traditional institutions with new concepts of collective identity. Spain, therefore, became an early example of how Napoleon's expansion could unintentionally encourage the development of national consciousness. The empire that had sought to reorganize Europe under a coordinated political system was now facing a different kind of challenge, one rooted not only in armies and alliances, but also in the growing sense that communities across the continent possessed identities that could not easily be absorbed into a single imperial structure. While resistance in Spain revealed how local populations could oppose Napoleon through prolonged conflict, a different response was taking shape in the German-speaking regions of Europe. There, the reaction to Napoleon's dominance did not immediately appear as widespread rebellion. Instead, it began with a period of reflection and reform, particularly in the Kingdom of Prussia. The turning point had come in 1806, when Prussia suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of Napoleon's armies during the battles of Jena and Auerstedt. The Prussian military, which had once been regarded as one of the most disciplined forces in Europe since the time of Frederick the Great, collapsed with surprising speed. French troops soon occupied Berlin, and Prussia was forced to accept harsh conditions under the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. For many observers within the kingdom, the defeat was not simply a military failure, but a sign that the state itself required fundamental change. In the years that followed, a group of reform-minded officials began to rethink how Prussia should be governed. Leaders such as Baron Heinrich von Stein and Karl August von Hardenberg believed that the traditional structures of the old regime had weakened the state's ability to compete with a modern power like Napoleon's France. They therefore introduced reforms intended to modernize administration, strengthen the economy, and reorganize the relationship between the government and its citizens. One of the most significant measures was the abolition of certain forms of serfdom that had tied peasants to noble estates. Peasants were gradually granted greater freedom to move, own property, and participate in economic life. These changes were designed not only to improve social conditions, but also to create a population more capable of contributing to the strength of the state. Military reform followed a similar logic. After the defeats of 1806, Prussian leaders recognized that the older system of a rigid professional army supported by aristocratic officers was no longer sufficient. Reformers such as Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August von Gneisenau worked to reorganize the army by expanding recruitment and emphasizing training that would allow a broader segment of society to participate in national defense. The goal was to create a military force that reflected the strength of the nation rather than the privilege of a particular class. Although these changes took time to implement, they marked an important step toward transforming Prussia into a more modern state, capable of mobilizing its population during times of war. At the same time, intellectual life in the German territories was undergoing its own transformation. Writers, philosophers, and educators began discussing the idea that people who shared a common language, culture, and historical experience might also share a deeper sense of national identity. Figures such as Johann Gottlieb Fichte delivered public lectures that encouraged audiences to think about the German people as part of a broader cultural community. These discussions did not immediately create a unified Germany, which remained divided among numerous states within the Confederation of the Rhine and other political structures. Yet they contributed to a growing awareness that political independence and cultural identity could be closely connected. Napoleon's reorganization of Central Europe had therefore produced an unexpected result. The defeat of older monarchies and the spread of administrative reforms had demonstrated the power of a modern state guided by centralized institutions. At the same time, the experience of foreign domination encouraged many people in the German territories to consider how their own societies might be strengthened. Reformers sought to modernize their governments, while intellectuals explored the meaning of national identity. These developments did not immediately overturn Napoleon's influence, but they quietly prepared the ground for future resistance. In the years ahead, the ideas and reforms that had emerged during this period would play an important role when European powers once again challenged the dominance of Napoleon's empire. As the years passed, the reactions that had begun in Spain and the German states gradually revealed a deeper pattern across the European continent. Napoleon had reorganized governments, replaced dynasties, introduced modern legal systems, and attempted to coordinate economic policy across a vast network of territories. From the perspective of imperial administration, these changes were meant to stabilize Europe under a system guided by French leadership. Yet the experience of living within this system often produced an unexpected response among the populations of those territories. Instead of dissolving older loyalties, Napoleon's dominance sometimes encouraged people to reflect more strongly on their own collective identities. In different parts of Europe, this reflection took different forms, but it shared a common theme. Communities were beginning to think of themselves not simply as subjects of a ruler, but as members of a broader nation defined by language, culture, and shared historical experience. In Spain, resistance had already taken the form of guerrilla warfare and local uprisings against French control. In the German territories, intellectual discussions about national identity were emerging alongside reforms designed to strengthen the state. Similar developments could be observed in other regions, influenced by Napoleon's empire. In Italy, where Napoleon had reorganized several states and introduced administrative reforms, intellectuals and political thinkers began to consider the possibility that the various Italian territories might one day form a more unified political community. The idea did not yet translate into immediate political action, but the conversations reflected a growing awareness that shared language and cultural traditions could form the basis of a larger national identity. These reflections were partly shaped by the very reforms Napoleon had introduced. By simplifying political boundaries, standardizing legal systems, and strengthening centralized administrations, his empire unintentionally created conditions in which people could imagine their societies operating as larger political units than before. At the same time, the pressures created by war and imperial administration intensified these reflections. Conscription policies required men from many different regions to serve in armies connected to Napoleon's campaigns. Economic regulations, including the continental system, affected trade and everyday life across multiple territories. Administrative reforms altered the relationships between governments and local communities. All of these experiences reminded populations that they were living within a system directed from outside their own traditional political structures. For some individuals, this system represented modernization and reform. For others, it raised questions about autonomy and independence. The result was not a single unified movement of opposition, but rather a gradual growth of national awareness that appeared in different forms across the continent. These developments introduced a new dimension into European politics. Earlier conflicts had largely been struggles between dynasties and states seeking territorial advantage. Now, in certain regions, political resistance was beginning to draw strength from the idea that a nation defined by its people, rather than solely by its ruler, possessed a legitimate claim to independence. This idea had roots in the revolutionary period, yet it gained new meaning as communities experienced life within Napoleon's continental system. The empire that sought to reorganize Europe under centralized authority was therefore contributing, perhaps unintentionally, to the spread of political ideas that emphasized the independence of distinct national communities. By the early 1810s, Napoleon's empire still appeared powerful. His armies remained among the strongest in Europe, and his network of allied states continued to operate across much of the continent. Yet, beneath the structure of this system, the reactions it had provoked were slowly reshaping the political imagination of Europe. In Spain, in the German territories, in parts of Italy, and elsewhere, discussions about national identity and political autonomy were becoming more common. These conversations did not immediately dismantle Napoleon's power, but they formed part of a broader shift that would influence the conflicts soon to come. As the empire continued to expand and confront new challenges, the forces it had unintentionally awakened would play an increasingly important role in determining the future of Europe. By the early 1810s, Napoleon's empire had reached a scale that few European rulers before him had ever achieved. From Spain in the west to the frontiers of Poland in the east, a vast network of states now operated within the system shaped by his victories. Allied kingdoms, reorganized territories, and satellite governments connected much of continental Europe to the authority of the French Empire. Yet maintaining such a wide structure required constant effort. Armies had to remain active across distant regions. Governments needed to enforce policies, such as the continental system, and alliances had to be managed carefully. The stability of the entire system depended heavily on Napoleon's ability to keep rival powers under control. One of the most important of those powers was the Russian Empire. At first, Russia had been part of Napoleon's diplomatic arrangement after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. Following Napoleon's victories over Prussia and Russia earlier that year, Tsar Alexander I had agreed to a temporary partnership with France. For a time, the two empires appeared to cooperate in maintaining the new political order across Europe. Russia accepted the existence of the Confederation of the Rhine and other changes in Central Europe, while France recognized Russian influence in certain eastern regions. However, this relationship was never entirely stable. Both empires possessed long-term ambitions that did not always align. Russia remained a major continental power with its own strategic interests, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Baltic region. As the years passed, tensions gradually increased between the two governments. One of the central issues dividing them involved the continental system, Endestrage. Napoleon expected all allied or cooperating states to enforce the blockade against British trade. For Russia, however, this policy created economic difficulties. Russian exports, especially grain, timber, and raw materials, had traditionally been sold in markets connected to British commerce. Restricting these trade routes placed pressure on Russian merchants and landowners. By the early 1810s, Russian authorities began relaxing their enforcement of the continental system, allowing some trade with Britain to resume. From Napoleon's perspective, this decision threatened the entire strategy designed to weaken his most persistent rival. If a major continental power openly ignored the system, other states might follow. Political tensions also grew as Napoleon continued to reshape territories along Russia's western frontier. The creation of the Duchy of Warsaw, a state formed from lands that had once belonged to Poland and later been controlled by Prussia, raised concerns in St. Petersburg. Russian leaders worried that a revived Polish state aligned with France might eventually challenge Russian influence in the region. Although Napoleon did not openly promise the restoration of a fully independent Poland, the existence of the duchy created uncertainty about his long-term intentions. For Tsar Alexander, this development added another reason to question the stability of the alliance with France. By 1812, the relationship between the two empires had deteriorated significantly. Diplomatic negotiations failed to resolve the growing disagreements over trade, territorial influence, and the balance of power in Eastern Europe. Napoleon began preparing for a military campaign on a scale far larger than any he had previously undertaken. The army assembled for this expedition was known as the Grande Armée, and it included soldiers not only from France but also from many allied states within the Napoleonic system. Troops from Italy, the Confederation of the Rhine, Poland, and other regions joined the campaign, reflecting the continental reach of Napoleon's empire. In total, the force numbered hundreds of thousands of men, making it one of the largest armies ever assembled in Europe up to that time. In June 1812, this immense army crossed the Niemen River and advanced into Russian territory. Napoleon expected that a decisive series of battles would force Russia to negotiate peace, much as earlier campaigns had compelled other European powers to accept his terms. Yet the geography and strategy of the Russian campaign would soon reveal challenges very different from those he had faced in Central Europe. The distances were vast, supply lines stretched across unfamiliar terrain, and Russian forces avoided committing themselves to a single decisive confrontation in the early stages of the invasion. What had begun as another campaign intended to reinforce Napoleon's continental system was about to become one of the most difficult and consequential episodes of the entire Napoleonic era. When Napoleon's Grande Armée crossed into Russian territory in the summer of 1812, the campaign began with the confidence that had accompanied many of his earlier victories. The army assembled for the invasion was enormous by the standards of the time, numbering more than 600,000 soldiers at the beginning of the operation. It was not composed only of French troops. Soldiers from across Napoleon's continental system marched alongside them, Poles from the Duchy of Warsaw, Germans from the Confederation of the Rhine, Italians, Dutch, and others from Allied states. In many ways, the army itself reflected the reach of Napoleon's empire, drawing manpower from across much of Europe. The expectation was that such a force would overwhelm Russian resistance through speed and decisive battle, forcing Tsar Alexander I to negotiate before the campaign stretched too far into the vast eastern territories. Yet the Russian leadership adopted a strategy that differed from the responses Napoleon had encountered in earlier wars. Instead of concentrating their forces for an early confrontation, Russian commanders withdrew deeper into their own territory as the French army advanced. This retreat frustrated Napoleon's hope for a quick and decisive engagement. Each time French troops moved forward, Russian forces moved farther away, avoiding the kind of battle that might end the war quickly. As they retreated, Russian units often destroyed supplies, crops, and infrastructure that might have supported the advancing army. This method, sometimes described as a scorched earth strategy, left the French forces with fewer local resources as they moved deeper into the country. The geography of Russia also created difficulties that Napoleon had rarely faced in Western and Central Europe. Distances between cities and supply centers were enormous, roads were often rough, and communication between different sections of the army became increasingly complicated as the campaign progressed. The Grande Armée relied heavily on long supply lines that stretched back toward the borders of Central Europe. As those lines extended farther east, transporting food, equipment, and ammunition became slower and less reliable. Soldiers who had expected a swift campaign soon found themselves marching through vast territories where provisions were scarce and the pace of movement slowed. Despite these challenges, Napoleon continued advancing, hoping that the Russian army would eventually be forced to stand and fight. That moment finally came in September 1812, near the village of Borodino, not far from the road leading to Moscow. The battle that followed became one of the largest and most intense confrontations of the Napoleonic Wars. Both armies deployed tens of thousands of soldiers across a broad battlefield marked by fortified positions, artillery batteries, and defensive earthworks constructed by the Russian forces. Fighting lasted throughout the day, with repeated assaults and counterattacks that produced heavy casualties on both sides. By the end of the battle, the Russian army withdrew from the field, allowing Napoleon to claim a tactical victory. Yet the cost had been extremely high. Thousands of soldiers had been killed or wounded, and the Russian army, though damaged, had not been destroyed. Instead of collapsing or surrendering, it retreated again toward Moscow, preserving enough strength to continue the campaign. For Napoleon, the result was far from the decisive triumph he had expected. The road to Moscow was now open, but the Russian army remained capable of fighting another day. In mid-September 1812, Napoleon's forces entered Moscow. Traditionally, the capture of a capital city often signaled the end of a campaign in European warfare. Napoleon likely hoped that occupying Moscow would pressure Tsar Alexander into negotiations, yet events unfolded in an unexpected way. Much of the city had already been evacuated by its inhabitants, and soon after the French arrival, fires broke out across large sections of Moscow. The flames spread rapidly through wooden buildings, destroying supplies and shelter that Napoleon's army might have used to sustain itself during the occupation. Whether started intentionally or accidentally, the fires transformed Moscow into a city that offered little support for the army that had just captured it. Napoleon waited in Moscow for several weeks, hoping that diplomatic messages from the Russian court might arrive. None came. Instead, the French army found itself stranded in a devastated city as the weeks passed and the Russian autumn approached. The campaign that had begun with the expectation of a swift victory was slowly turning into a dangerous situation. Supplies were limited, the Russian army remained active in the surrounding regions, and the approaching winter threatened to make conditions even more difficult for an army operating far from its bases in Central Europe. The invasion of Russia had been intended to reinforce Napoleon's continental system and force a powerful rival back into alignment with his policies. Instead, the campaign was beginning to reveal how difficult it was to sustain control across such vast distances. What had once seemed like the strongest army in Europe was now deep inside a hostile landscape, facing challenges that strategy and battlefield skill alone could not easily overcome. As the weeks passed in Moscow during the autumn of 1812, it became increasingly clear that Napoleon's expectations of a negotiated peace would not be fulfilled. Tsar Alexander, I refused to send representatives to discuss terms while French troops remained deep within Russian territory. Meanwhile, the situation facing the Grande Armée grew more uncertain with each passing day. The fires that had swept through Moscow had destroyed large quantities of food and shelter that might have supported the army during the occupation. Soldiers who had marched across Europe with the expectation of a swift victory now found themselves in a damaged city, far from their supply bases, as the weather slowly began to change. By October, Napoleon faced a difficult decision. Remaining in Moscow without reliable supplies could expose the army to severe hardship once winter arrived. Yet, withdrawing from the city meant abandoning the campaign's original objective without achieving a political settlement. Eventually, Napoleon ordered the army to begin its retreat toward the west. What followed would become one of the most difficult marches in European military history. As the Grande Armée left Moscow, it was no longer the massive force that had crossed into Russia months earlier. Casualties from earlier battles, disease, desertion, and the long march across Russian territory had already reduced its numbers. The retreat forced the army to travel across lands that had been stripped of resources during the earlier advance. Villages had been emptied, food supplies were scarce, and transport animals had died in large numbers. These conditions made it difficult to carry the provisions needed to sustain such a large body of troops. The Russian army, which had avoided decisive destruction earlier in the campaign, now followed the retreating French forces at a distance. Instead of launching a single, overwhelming attack, Russian commanders allowed exhaustion, cold weather, and shortages of food to weaken the army as it moved westward. Smaller engagements and attacks on isolated units increased the pressure on Napoleon's troops, who were already struggling with declining morale and physical exhaustion. As November approached, temperatures across the Russian plains began to fall sharply. Soldiers who had not been equipped for prolonged winter conditions faced freezing winds and snow-covered roads. Horses died in increasing numbers, reducing the army's ability to move artillery and supply wagons. Many soldiers marched on foot through deep snow, wrapped in whatever clothing they could find. The retreat became slower and more chaotic, as units struggled to remain organized under these conditions. One of the most dramatic moments of the retreat occurred near the Berezina River in late November 1812. As the French army attempted to cross the river while Russian forces approached from multiple directions, engineers worked rapidly to construct temporary bridges. Thousands of soldiers and civilians crowded the riverbanks, hoping to escape before Russian troops closed in completely. The crossing succeeded in allowing a portion of the army to continue westward, but heavy losses occurred during the operation. The event became a symbol of the desperate effort to save what remained of the Grande Armée. By the time the remnants of Napoleon's forces finally recrossed the borders of Central Europe in December 1812, the scale of the disaster had become clear. Only a fraction of the soldiers who had begun the campaign were still capable of continuing military service. The Grande Armée, once the most formidable army in Europe, had been largely destroyed by a combination of distance, climate, logistical breakdown, and constant pressure from Russian forces. The consequences of the campaign extended far beyond the loss of soldiers. Across Europe, governments that had once hesitated to challenge Napoleon now recognized that his power was no longer invincible. The defeat in Russia weakened the structure that had supported his continental system. Allied states began reconsidering their loyalty, and rival powers prepared to form new coalitions against the French Empire. The vast network of kingdoms, alliances, and reforms that Napoleon had built over the previous decade now faced a new reality. The campaign intended to reinforce his authority across Europe had instead opened the path toward the gradual collapse of the empire itself. After the catastrophe of the Russian campaign in 1812, the political balance of Europe began to shift in ways that had once seemed unlikely. For more than a decade, Napoleon had dominated continental affairs through military victories, diplomatic arrangements, and the network of allied states connected to his empire. Yet, the destruction of the Grande Armée created a moment of opportunity for the powers that had long opposed him. Across Europe, governments that had previously been cautious now reconsidered their position. The image of Napoleon as an unstoppable force had been weakened, and many rulers realized that cooperation against France might now succeed where earlier coalitions had failed. One of the first countries to change its position was Prussia. After years of operating under the restrictions imposed by Napoleon, following the defeat of 1806, Prussian leaders recognized that the moment had arrived to act. In early 1813, Prussia formally joined Russia in a renewed effort to challenge French dominance in Central Europe. The alliance marked the beginning of what historians call the War of the Sixth Coalition. Soon afterward, other powers, including Britain, Sweden, and eventually Austria, also joined the coalition. For the first time since the height of Napoleon's empire, several major European states were coordinating their military efforts on a large scale, with the shared objective of reducing French influence across the continent. The conflict that followed spread across much of Central Europe. During 1813, Napoleon moved quickly to rebuild his army after the losses in Russia, drawing new recruits from France and from allied states still connected to his empire. Despite the enormous setback of the previous year, he remained an experienced commander capable of organizing rapid campaigns. Several early battles during the spring of 1813 demonstrated that the French army could still fight effectively. Yet the broader strategic situation had changed. The coalition forces now possessed greater numbers and were determined to avoid the mistakes that had led to earlier defeats. Rather than confronting Napoleon in isolated engagements, they coordinated their movements more carefully, gradually increasing pressure across different regions of the continent. The turning point came in October 1813, near the city of Leipzig in what is now Germany. The confrontation that unfolded there became known as the Battle of Leipzig, or the Battle of Nations. It was one of the largest battles ever fought in Europe before the 20th century, involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers from multiple armies. French forces faced a coalition composed of Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and Swedish troops who had united in their effort to defeat Napoleon. Over several days of fighting, the coalition armies gradually pushed the French forces back from their positions. Despite determined resistance, Napoleon's army was eventually forced to retreat from the battlefield. The defeat at Leipzig carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate military loss. Several states that had previously belonged to Napoleon's network of allies began to abandon their support for the French Empire. German territories that had been part of the Confederation of the Rhine reconsidered their position as coalition armies advanced across Central Europe. The political system Napoleon had built over many years began to unravel with surprising speed. As coalition forces moved westward toward France itself, the structure that had once linked much of the continent to his authority weakened rapidly. By early 1814, the war had reached French territory. Coalition armies crossed the borders and advanced toward Paris, confronting Napoleon with the reality that the struggle could no longer be contained beyond France's frontiers. After a series of battles and political negotiations, Napoleon eventually abdicated his position as emperor in April 1814. The coalition powers decided to send him into exile on the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. For the moment, the long period of warfare that had begun with the French Revolution appeared to be reaching its conclusion. Yet the fall of Napoleon did not simply restore Europe to the world that had existed before his rise. The wars had transformed borders, governments, and political ideas across the continent. Even as the victorious powers prepared to reorganize Europe through diplomacy, they faced the challenge of deciding what should replace the system that Napoleon had built. The next stage of Europe's history would involve not only the defeat of an empire, but also the question of how a continent that had experienced such dramatic change could find a new balance. After Napoleon's abdication in 1814 and his exile to the island of Elba, many people across Europe believed that the long period of upheaval that had begun with the French Revolution was finally coming to an end. The great powers that had fought against France now faced a different task. For more than 2 decades, war had repeatedly reshaped the political map of the continent. Kingdoms had fallen, borders had moved, and entire regions had been reorganized under new systems of administration and law. With Napoleon removed from power, European leaders began gathering to determine how the continent should be governed in the future. Their goal was not simply to defeat France, but to restore stability and prevent another single power from dominating Europe in the way Napoleon had done. The meeting that would shape this new order became known as the Congress of Vienna. Beginning in late 1814, representatives from the major European powers assembled in the Austrian capital to negotiate the political reconstruction of the continent. Among the most influential figures were Austria's foreign minister, Clemens von Metternich, Britain's representative Lord Castlereagh, Russia's Tsar Alexander I, and diplomats from Prussia and other states. Although France had been the defeated power, it was eventually represented as well, reflecting the desire to integrate the country into the new European system rather than isolate it completely. The discussions at Vienna were complex and often prolonged. Diplomats debated how borders should be drawn, which dynasties should be restored to their thrones, and how power should be balanced among the major states. One of the central principles guiding their decisions was the concept of balance of power. European leaders believed that stability could be preserved if no single country possessed enough strength to dominate the others. By adjusting territorial boundaries and strengthening certain states along France's borders, they hoped to create a political arrangement that would discourage future attempts at continental domination. Several important territorial changes emerged from these negotiations. The Kingdom of the Netherlands was expanded to include the former Austrian Netherlands, creating a stronger state along France's northern frontier. Prussia received territories in western Germany along the Rhine, giving it a strategic position that would later play a significant role in European politics. Austria regained influence in northern Italy, while Russia secured control over much of Poland through the creation of the Congress Kingdom of Poland. Across the continent, borders were adjusted to reflect the new balance the diplomats hoped to achieve. At the same time, many of the rulers who had been displaced during the Napoleonic era were restored to power. Dynasties returned to Spain, Naples, and several other states that had once been governed by Napoleon's relatives or allies. These restorations reflected the desire of many European leaders to re-establish traditional monarchies that had existed before the revolutionary period. Yet the world they returned to was not identical to the one that had existed before 1789. The decades of war and reform had changed societies across Europe. Administrative systems had been modernized, legal reforms had spread, and ideas about citizenship and national identity had become more widely discussed. While the Congress of Vienna was still underway, events unexpectedly disrupted the sense of final resolution that many diplomats had hoped to achieve. In March 1815, Napoleon escaped from exile on Elba and returned to France. His arrival quickly gathered support among segments of the French army and population, allowing him to regain power for a brief period known as the 100 Days. European governments responded immediately by forming another coalition and preparing for renewed conflict. The final confrontation occurred in June 1815, near the village of Waterloo in present-day Belgium. Napoleon's forces faced an Allied army commanded by the British general Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, along with Prussian forces under General Gebhard von Blücher. After a long and intense battle, the coalition armies succeeded in defeating Napoleon's forces. The defeat ended Napoleon's return to power and marked the final collapse of his rule. Soon afterward, he was sent into a more distant exile on the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the remainder of his life. The conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars did not erase the transformations that had taken place across Europe. The diplomats at Vienna restored many traditional institutions, yet the reforms and political ideas that had spread during Napoleon's era continued to influence the continent. Legal systems shaped by the Napoleonic Code remained in several regions. Administrative structures created during the period survived in various states, and discussions about national identity continued to develop in places that had experienced both reform and resistance. The empire that had once seemed capable of uniting much of Europe had disappeared, but the changes it introduced continued to echo across the continent long after the battles had ended. As the battles ended and the diplomats of Europe attempted to restore order after 1815, the continent entered a period that appeared, at least on the surface, calmer than the decades that had preceded it. The Congress of Vienna had rebuilt a political balance intended to prevent any single empire from dominating Europe again. Monarchies were restored, borders were adjusted, and alliances were designed to maintain stability through cooperation among the major powers. For a time, this system, sometimes called the Concert of Europe, helped avoid the kind of continent-wide wars that had marked the Napoleonic era. Yet beneath the restored structures of kings and dynasties, the deeper transformations of the previous 25 years could not simply be undone. The Europe that emerged after Napoleon was not the same continent that had existed before his rise. Many of the reforms introduced during the Napoleonic period quietly remained in place. In several regions, legal systems influenced by the Napoleonic Code continued to shape courts and civil administration. Governments that had adopted centralized bureaucratic structures during the period found them efficient and chose to keep them. Roads, administrative districts, and taxation systems designed during the Napoleonic era often survived because they helped states function more effectively. Even rulers who had once opposed Napoleon sometimes recognized that certain reforms had modernized governance in ways that were difficult to reverse. The empire itself had collapsed, but parts of the institutional framework it introduced continued to influence how European societies organized their governments. At the same time, the political ideas that had circulated during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic years did not disappear. Discussions about citizenship, national identity, and political representation continued to appear across the continent. In Spain, in the German territories, in Italy, and in other regions that had experienced both reform and resistance, people had begun thinking about the relationship between governments and the communities they ruled. The experience of foreign domination, combined with the administrative changes of the Napoleonic period, had encouraged many individuals to imagine political communities larger than the fragmented states that had existed before. In the decades that followed, movements advocating national unity would gradually appear in several parts of Europe. The unifications of Italy and Germany, later in the 19th century, would grow partly from the ideas that had circulated during the age of Napoleon. Yet the legacy of Napoleon's empire remained complex. His system had been built through conquest and maintained through military power. Many regions remembered the heavy burdens of war, taxation, and conscription that had accompanied his rule. For those who had resisted French domination, the memory of the empire was tied to the struggle for independence rather than to the promise of continental unity. At the same time, historians have often noted that Napoleon's rule demonstrated something that earlier centuries had rarely shown so clearly: that the political map of Europe was not fixed. Within little more than a decade, borders had been redrawn, ancient institutions had disappeared, and a continent long divided into hundreds of small jurisdictions had been reorganized into larger political structures. Even though the Congress of Vienna restored many traditional arrangements, the idea that Europe could be reshaped through new systems of law, administration, and cooperation had already been revealed. In this sense, Napoleon's empire left behind a paradox that continues to invite reflection. On one hand, his attempt to organize Europe under French leadership provoked resistance that strengthened national identities across the continent. On the other hand, the administrative and legal reforms associated with his rule showed that different regions of Europe could operate within shared institutional frameworks. The same empire that awakened national resistance also demonstrated how deeply connected European societies already were through trade, law, and political ideas. For people living in the quiet decades that followed the Napoleonic Wars, these questions remained unresolved. The rulers who had restored the balance of power hoped that stability would endure if each state respected the independence of the others. Yet the memories of the revolutionary and Napoleonic years continued to shape political thought across Europe. Writers, reformers, and political leaders debated how a continent with so many languages, cultures, and histories might coexist peacefully while still preserving its diversity. And so the story that began with Napoleon's rise did not truly end with his defeat. The empire disappeared, but the questions it raised remained part of Europe's long historical conversation. Was Napoleon merely a conqueror whose ambitions briefly disrupted the balance of nations? Or did his empire reveal that Europe, despite its divisions, could one day be organized according to shared principles and institutions? The answer, like the quiet landscape of Europe after the wars, remained open, waiting for future generations to decide what kind of continent they wished to build.